Now, welcome back. Now, as I indicated in the previous tutorial, we are going to have the second part, which is the Slideshow app. Now, if you haven't actually completed the third tutorial, which is the first part of these two tutorial session, you need to first of all complete the third tutorial before you attempt this. Other than that, you might have some difficulty because certain issues may not be very clear to you. So please take time to complete the third tutorial before you join this particular one. Now, in this tutorial, we are going to design and implement a VB application that we would use to view pictures with the following functionalities. That is, you should be able to traverse the various pictures. That is, you visit each picture at least once, and then you step through to the end, or you can step from the end to the first image and so on. So you move to the first image or the last image, depending on how you want to do it. Or you can even start a slideshow that the images will play and wait a certain number of seconds each, and then move to the next image and so on. And then you also should be able to intermittently stop the slideshow at any image, right, and restart it later, and so on and so forth. So this here is a very simple application that we are going to create, but then we are just going to test some of the issues that come with repetition structure. That is, if you create a loop, for instance, that runs a very long time, it might end up freezing your user interface, that your user interface would become a bit unresponsive, and then it will reduce the usability of your system or the user friendliness of your system. In other words, your users might think that your system is freezing, not knowing there are just some operations working in the background. So usually when we have loops that take a bit of a long time to execute, we tend to do to put the interface on a separate thread from the loop, so that the user interface will remain responsive as the loop actually goes on. So we will learn how to do some of these things. In this particular example, we are going to use the background worker thread to try to do all these things. That is, we separate the user interface from the loops so that different processes, for instance, can take turns to actually execute these two separate tasks at the same time, so that your your user interface will not freeze. All right. So we will do these using some of these things, right? So the background worker control is what we are going to use to actually manage this. So we are going to use that to run our application on different threads. That is the user interface on one thread, and then the loop on a separate thread, so that we don't cause our user interface to freeze. Now also we would look at the progress bar, which is usually a horizontal bar that we use to monitor the progress of our background activities. So this is commonly used when we are installing applications. You see that as the installation is going on, you will see a progress bar, because you don't get to see what is going on, and just to sit and wait and not know what is going on will be a bit frustrating, right? So the progress bar is used to kind of give you an indication of what is happening in the background, and then how much of it is completed, how much of it is still left to go, and so on and so forth. So even when you are playing a movie, you are playing music, we use a progress bar to indicate how much of the music has gone already and how much is still left to go. So we are going to see how we can use a progress bar to monitor our slideshow, to see how many pictures have been viewed so far, and then how many are left, what percentage of it, and so on and so forth. Now, the image list is just like a list box, but in this case, we are not talking about list box of items. We are talking about list box of images, right? And unlike list box that has the list displaying inside the list box, an image list usually is hiding behind the scene. But if to contain a list of images, then we can now go ahead and use the picture box to display these images one image at a time, right? Okay, so we are going to see how all this is done. So this is basically how our user interface would be like. Now here we have our window, and then here we have our picture box. Now this is just an image that I put there to represent my slideshow. And then this here is the progress bar, this horizontal this rectangle here. Then we also have these buttons, about 6 of them, that we are going to use to navigate or to traverse our images. So the first, this is next. So anytime we click on this to take us the next picture, and so on. Now this one here will take us to the last picture. All right. Then this one here will take us to the previous picture. So we go previous till we get to the end. Now this one here will take us to the very first image. Okay. Now here, when we come here, we click on this to start this slideshow and play each image one at a time, with each image resting for 5 seconds and moving ahead. Of course, in our code, we can always change how many seconds the image should wait. All right. So, and then also we have another button here that we can use to stop the slideshow. Now, these are all normal buttons. These are just some decorations I put on them, or some colors I put on them to make them look different. Okay, so we are going to add one picture box to our user interface. We add one image list. We add a progress bar. We add 6 buttons, right? For now, that is what we are going to add. And as we go on, we would add more controls to make sure we achieve whatever we set out to achieve. So you create, here we are not going to create a new Windows application. We are going to work with the old application from our previous tutorial. Now the tutorial in which we created the product finder app. So we are just going to add a new form to that project, and then we create the slideshow on that form. All right. So here, this is, let's go back to our Visual Studio. This is our good old Visual Studio that we've been working with. So this is our the project from our previous tutorial, in which we designed a product finder app. Now, in order to complete the next tutorial, we would need to add a new form to our project. So we can add a new form by going to project. We go to the menu, select project, and then select Windows Forms. Now, when Windows Form comes, we will change the name to slideshow. So we have slideshow app. All right, .vb. That is the new form we want to add. Now, once the new form is added, we just expand it a little bit, and then we do our usual. We change the text property to slideshow app, or whatever name, whatever we want to put there, or we could say image viewer, whatever. Okay, so here we have this, and we said we are going to add a picture viewer. So we add picture box. So we have a picture box here that we need to add. All right, then we have image list. Now this image list, as I indicated, will not come on the form. It will come right beneath the form. So let's put it on this. So you see, even though I dropped it on the form, it didn't come on the form. It came right underneath. Right. So when it comes underneath, we now configure it from here, then we will let the picture box display the images that we put here one at a time. So the next thing is we put our buttons. So we put how many buttons? About 6 buttons was what I counted. So we have 6 buttons. All right. So we have 6 buttons. About 6 buttons. So let's arrange them here and see how far we go with that. So these are 6 buttons. So those are the 6 buttons. So we also expand the picture box just like we did it in our previous example. That was a few months ago. So we have this. So this is the picture box, and these are the buttons, and these are the image. This is the image list. So basically, this is our user interface. Very simple user interface. Now, the first thing we usually would do is to configure these buttons here in terms of their name property and their text property. So let's start with the text properties of these buttons. So we would have the text property here. We just use the bar on our keyboard. So you just use the bar on our keyboard and then a less than sign, right? So these are just very simple symbols that are on our keyboard, right? Then here we use 2 less than signs to indicate that we are moving backwards. Then here we will do the opposite. So we will have a greater than sign and a bar, right, to indicate that we want to move to the last image. And then we have the double greater than signs to indicate that we want to go to the next image. Now here we have start slideshow. So I'm sure it won't be enough, but then we would expand it a little bit as we go. Start slideshow, and this is end slideshow or stop slideshow. All right, so let's use stop slideshow. So if you want, you can just say start. If you want, you can just say stop. So we would reduce this a little bit because we don't need all this space. So we'll make it into smaller buttons so that we could expand this more. All right, so we could expand this a little bit. So we would have that. All right, so you organize yours the way you feel comfortable with. Some of you will be better designers than I am, so you design it as perfectly as possible. So this basically what I get. So we could use the font property of these text boxes. Basically begin to use 4 color, right? So that's we like go to the font. If we want, we could make them let's say bold, right? So we can make them bold. We can change the color. We can change the size. So we could do this, make it bold and make it 10. All right. So it looks like this. Then we could change the color of it to maybe something like this. No, not too nice. Or we could do something like this, or maybe a bit more colorful, maybe like that, right? So we could leave it as it is here, and then here we would we might change the background color of this. Now I made it yellowish. No, I made it green, I think. So we change the back color to green. All right, then here we change the back color to something a bit reddish or brownish. All right, of course we need to change the type of button to something else to make it look a bit different from we have now. So flat style, we can change the flat style to maybe something pop-up, right? So to remove that border that was around it. So if you have something like this, right? Now this could be, you could change these ones also to be same, right? We could add a little bit of color to them also. Remember, this is a slideshow, so there won't be anything wrong with adding a little bit of color to it. So we could add a background color, something that looks a bit different. And then we could remove the various border by changing the flat style to pop-up. Now this here is looking too colorful. You might change it, right? So you just sit down, play around with it a little bit and see how it goes. Because usually, right, that is too pinkish. So decide what you want to do with it, right? So however you want it to go, you make it go like that. So that is basically what we get. So we can now begin to change the name properties of these here. So this is BTN. So we will have BTN. So BTN first. As for the first button, BTN previous. So BTN previous. So we have BTN start. And we have BTN stop. BTN stop. All right, and we have BTN next, and we have BTN last. BTN last. So these are the buttons we have. So we could even add a label here that we can use to close our form. So we could add a label, for instance, something like this. We could add a small text here that we could use to exit, LBL exit. All right, so we will see, so we can just put a small X here, right, that we can click on to exit our application. All right, in that case we could put a little border around it. So let's look for border style. Put a little border around this label, right? So I'm just doing this so that you see some of the things that we could do with some of these things. So if you put a border style, you could also put, let's say, a back color to it, right? So if you put a back color to your label, right, so you could see something like this, right? So you could, right, so you can see as soon as you begin to do it, it begins to look like one of these buttons, right? So we can configure any of these controls basically to look however we want it to look, and then we can play around with it to do something about it. So once we do that, then we could basically use the click event of this button here to basically program anything that we want, right? So we could use the double click on it and write me.close. So anytime the user clicks on this label, then the form will close, something like that. So once we finish with this, the next thing would be to configure the image list control. So this is where we go and add our images. So we go to the bottom of the form and we click on this arrow here, and then it will bring us something here that says choose images, right? Of course, the image size, usually 16 by 16, is not anything to write home about. That will give us a very small image. So we need to increase the image size a little bit to get us to see any meaningful image type. So once we come to this guy here, the next thing would be to add images to our project, the images that we will use for the slideshow. So we would choose images and navigate to somewhere in your computer where you have images stored. So usually you go to My Pictures, you should have some images that come with your computer installation, your Windows installation or your operating system installation, or you can just go online and download whatever images you want to use for this project. So here I would navigate to somewhere in my work. So when you click on choose images, this here will pop up, and then you go to add, right? And then you navigate to where you have the images stored, and then you add them to your project. So I have some images here. So if I can go to my desktop, right? So this is my desktop. So I go and look for sample images, right? So these are the images I have, some of the images I have in my desktop. So what I do is I just click on one of them and do Control All, right? So Control A, it will select all the images that I want to select, right? Or you can just use your drag over all the images to select all of them. So these are the images I want to use for my slideshow. All right. So I click on open. Right. When I click on open, it will load all these images that I have selected into the members list box. Right. So the members list box here contains the list of images. And then we also have here the properties of those images. So anytime you click on an image, you can go and then look at the properties of those images. So you have this image, these are the properties, right, and so on. All right. So when we are done, we would click OK. So when you click OK, all the images that you selected would be added to your image list. All right. So that is what we did. So the next thing would be to choose the depth of your image, right? So the depth would determine how many colors that or the resolution of your image. So usually the higher the resolution, the better, right? But then the higher the resolution, the bigger the size of your application would be. So usually I select something like 32-bit image, so you get a better depth. And then we can basically go ahead and increase the size of the image. So we can use maybe 250 pixels to 250 pixels, right? So that is the size of the images that I want. So I can display these images. Each of the images that I just added here would have these 250 pixels by 250 pixels, right? So that is basically what I want to do. So the next thing would be for us to code this and then assign each of these images to this particular picture box one at a time. Now remember, we have all the images here. So these are the images that we have, and each of these images, you can see there is some form of indexes, right? that are here. So we have 31 images. So starting from 0 to 31, we have 32 images in all. All right. So in that case, this first image will have an index of 0, second image will have an index of 1, and so on and so forth. So if we want to display the first image, so we just say image list 1 dot images, and then into bracket we put 0, right? So it will display the first image. If we want to display the fifth image, so we say image list 1 dot images into brackets 5, right? So it will display this particular image and so on. So the same way we worked with the list box dot items, and then we put into bracket the index, and it goes into the list box and fetch that particular item that has that particular index. All right. So anytime you are thinking about image list, think about a list box and a combo box, right? The only issue here is that the image list doesn't display the images on our user interface. It only acts as a container to hold the images. Then we can now use picture boxes and other controls to show these images on the user interface. All right. So let's go ahead and then we set it up. So you could go to your so when we come here, you could go to this here, and then basically begin to configure your image list, right? There are some things that we could configure here and so on, but for now this is what we have. So the next thing we'll do is to now code our program. Now to code our program, of course, usually with such a code, we would want our application to work in such a way that as soon as the application is run, an image is already loaded into it, right? Before we begin to do anything. So when the application is launched, we want to load the first image into the picture box. So we just write with index 0. So what index 0 means is that when we declare the index, it will have 0 from the beginning. So it makes things easy for us. So let's go to the load event of this form and then load an image into this picture box from the list box, right? And basically we are going to use the listbox.images property to do that, right? Okay. So let's go to the load event of this form. So we have slideshow app.load underscore load. So this is what will happen when our form is coming up. So we would have picture box. So we want to load an image into picture box 1. So we have picture box 1. Now remember, we didn't rename the picture box and the image list because we just have one, right? We don't have anything to differentiate them. If we have multiple picture boxes and multiple image boxes, image lists, then we will have to name them, give them unique names to uniquely identify them. But then if you want, you can still go ahead and create names for them. So we have picture box 1 dot image, right, is equal to image list 1. So image list 1 dot images, right, into brackets. What do we have? Index. Now we haven't declared index. Okay, so let's declare index. So we have private index. Of course, after index, we also need to store the total number of images in the list, in the image list. So we have number of images, as integer. So we have, okay. So now we are good. So when we run this application, we should have, now remember this here, when we declared it and we didn't assign any value to it, automatically 0 is assigned to it. So when we run this index here will be 0. So what it means is that it will go ahead and pick the first image inside the image list, which is this guy here. right? That is why we have it in our list. So if we don't want it, we could go and put in a different image, right? So let me look for a much more beautiful image than what I have. All my images look very dark. Let me get a brighter image, right? So I can move it up, right? So that will be the 0 image, right? So we have a much more brighter image than what I have in my picture. So in that case, if we run this application, we should have that brighter image here than the black one that I have. But then when we run it, it will still run our old application. So let's go back to our form 1 and then add a menu item in form 1 that will help us to view our form. So let's add a new Windows item called view, right? So go to the Windows, the menu item, and then we type in view. So under view, we say view slideshow, right? So if we hit on enter, we can go and change the name to what? Menu view, right? The name property we change to menu view. All right. So once we do this, then we can easily click this and enter the click event of the view button, and then we can just process our me.close, me.show. So we have what we have, slide show up right dot show. All right. So that is that. So anytime we click on this here, it will launch our new slideshow for us. So let's quickly run our application. So it will run the first, the interface from the first tutorial. That is the interface from the previous tutorial. And then once it comes up, we can quickly go to view and then click on our new window. So this is what we have. All right, so this is our slideshow that just popped up for us. All right, so we haven't programmed any part, we just have the image, but the image doesn't really look good. We have to change to a different image. Okay, but at least you see the trick, right? So once we do that, it will pick whatever image is the first one, or if we want, we can change the index into any other value from between 0 and 32, or 0 and 31. Then everything should work just fine. All right, let me quickly open it so that you guys will see what I'm talking about. So when we have this, let's share this screen in addition. Okay, so this is basically what we are looking at. So we have this. So when we run our application, this was what we got. And then we go to view and click on view, and then we have this showing up. Now once this shows up, we look at our image that is there, and then of course we can see we want our image to be big enough to cover everything. So we can try to increase the size of the image a little bit and see how it will work. But of course these buttons are still not working because we haven't programmed them, but the image has already appeared on our form. All right, so let's go and then continue with our programming. Okay, so let's get back to our Visual Studio. And then we get back to our form. Now let's see how large we can get our images to go. So let's try 300 and see if it will work. 300. So let's see. Now 300 doesn't want to pick the image. So the image size should be between 256 and 200. And all right, so let's maintain our 250. 250. All right. Just okay. So that is what we have. So we could go ahead and basically program all these buttons here to begin to do what we want them to do. So the first button that we would want to program is the next button, right? So at least that would help us to see whether it works or not. So we can just double click on this and then check on the next button. Now, how do we even program the next button? So we want to check and see if we are not on the last item, right? But if we are on the last item, we shouldn't be able to go next. We should stop there. But if we are not on the last item, you should add one to what the index, and then basically display the new image, right? It's just as simple as that. A very simple code. All right, so check and see whether you are on the last image, right? If the image is the last one. So how do we know if it is the last one? We will check, we will count the total number of images in the image list and subtract one from it to see if we are at the last index. If you are not at the last index, then we add one to the index and then we display the image that is there. Just a simple code. So we will do this. We have number of images that is equal to image list. That's image list one dot images dot count, right? Because we want to count the total images. So this one here will return an integer which will represent the total number of images in the list. So we will have, so when we know this, then we can check and see if we are at the last image. If you are not at the last image, just add one to it, then move to the next image. So we will check, how do we check if we are at the last image? So we say if the index, right, is greater than or equal to, that is the last index, right, which is number of images minus 1, right? So that's the last index. If it is greater than or equal to the last index, then what do? We will say we don't want to go anywhere. You are already at the last image. Then you print a message for them, right? So you have message box dot show, right? You can say this is the last image, right? So something like this. But if it is not in the last image, so else, what do? You should move to the next, add one to index and move to the next item, right? So index is equal to index plus 1, right? Then what do? You show the new picture with the new index, right? So picture box 1 dot image is equal to image list 1 dot images into bracket index, right? Okay. So that is basically what we are doing. So from here, what it means is that we check to see how many elements are in the image box, and we check to see if we are already on the last element. So we are here, we want to move next. if you're already in the last element, you shouldn't be able to move next. But if you are in any other element, you just add 1 to the index and then you display the image, right? So just like a for loop, that's what we are basically doing. So once you do this, you can basically run the application and then you see the effect of the code we just wrote. So hopefully if everything works well, we should be able to see, let's just add this to the list. So we shared. Okay, so once we run it, this is what we would get. So let me just share my screen and let's see how it goes. So once we run it, we would see a screen like this, and we go in there and then we'll see this. And then we'll move next, next, next. But we can see that our images are coming to the side, right? Which is not what we want. So we need to go to the picture box and then stretch it to occupy the entire window, right? So that is basically how we want it to work. So let's go back to our Visual Studio and then let's go to picture box and then we go to the top here and then instead of normal we select the this guy here to be what, in stretch mode, right? So it should stretch to fill the entire picture box. So this time when we run it, we'll begin to see it totally differently. So it's taking a while to come up. So once it comes up, we will begin to see how it will work. So we share the screen once more. Okay, so this is the window that we would have. So we share that. So now we see that we have a stretched image. So we could now go ahead and go through our images to see how it works, right? Of course, we could go ahead and program the last, the previous, and then the first. So the code will not differ much, right? So this is our, so once we get to the end, so it will say this is the last image and then it will end there and move on. So the next thing we will do is to program the rest of the buttons, right? So when we program this, then the next thing is to program that. So this here, of course, here we used to check for the next button, we used to check whether it was on the last item before we increase. For the previous, we would decrease, but then we decrease after we check whether we are on the first item. If we are on the first item, it means we can't go any further, right? But once we are not on the first item, we subtract 1 from the index and then we can show it to the image, right? So let's go ahead and see how we do that. All right. So here we are going to check, of course, we would have something like this. We write the same code basically, right? We could copy and paste and just change this condition and then change this here from plus to minus, and that will do the trick for us. So we say number of images is equal to image list image list 1 dot count dot images dot count, right? So once we count, then we can begin to use this. So we say if the index, right, is greater than 0, all right? So we can write it in 2 ways. So we check if it is not equal to 0, right, or if it is greater than or equal to 0, right? So we say if this is less than or equal to 0, right? Then what do we do? We would print out this same message here, that is message box the show you are on the first image, right? So if you are on the first image, you can't go any further. So if it is not, so that's else. What do? We subtract 1. So index is equal to index minus 1, right? Then picture box 1 dot image is equal to image list image list 1 dot images dot items dot item index. All right. So once we write it like this, so you can see it is just like the first one that we wrote. That is, we check to see if you are on the last object. If you are not on the last image, then we can go to the next image. Here we check to see if you are on the first image. If you are not on the first image, then we continue to do. So if the image is on the 0th index, which is the last image, then we have to stop there. We can't go any further. Other than that, then we would print out. So here we can only go to the end, right? And then we'll go to the end. Of course, we could write it in such a way that we would go around and loop through, right? Now looping through, I have that code in the lecture slides that are uploaded on the course page. You will find code that will help you to loop through. So in that case, when you click next, next, next to the end, once it gets to the end, it will start from the beginning again and loop to the end. So in that case, you don't have to stop at any point. But this particular code would get you to the end and stop there and won't allow you to move and start over. So there's no repetition. You go at once to the end. So this is the previous. So we need to do for the last element and then the first element, right? So to program the last element, right? So btn last, what do we need to do? We need to first of all check and see if you're already on the last element. If not, then we would basically go to the last element by forcing the index to the last index, right? So basically that is what we are talking about. All right, so we do the same. Okay, so we have the same code. Now I'm just repeating this code because I didn't create the value up there. So which I should have created the value as at the global level so that we won't be required to be repeating this first line of code. So number of images is equal to image list, all right, dot image list 1 dot images dot count, all right. Then we check if we are not already on the last element, right? So we say if index is not equal to, that's the last element, that's we have number of images minus 1. Then, so if we are not on the last element, then force it to the last element, right? So we have, if it is not already on the last element, so we say, then force it to the last element, which is index is equal to the number of images minus 1. So we force it to the last element, and then we basically picture box 1 dot images dot image is equal to image list 1 dot images dot item. Which item are we talking about? Item index. So once we do that, so we do first of all check if it is not already on the last element. If it is not already on the last element, I need to force it to the last element and then output. But if it is already on the last element, what do? We just keep telling the user he is already in the last element, so he can't go any further, right? So else message box will show, then just tell the user what we want to tell me. So this is the last image, right? Just like the other message. So the opposite will be true for the first. So the first, instead of checking if you are on the last element, we just check if we are on the first element. So we can basically copy this and paste and just do some little modification so that instead of checking this, we just check if it is not equal to 0, right? And that is equal to 0. Just the index of the first image, that is 0. So once we are able to move this to 0, we are just done with the code. So we just move, this is the first element. So we first of all check if the current index is not equal to 0. That means if we are not already on the last image, on the first image. If we are not already on the first image, what do? We force the index to be 0. That is, the current index should be 0. So we pass the 0 to the image list to retrieve the first image, right? And then we basically load the first image into the picture box. But if we are already on the last image, then we shouldn't do anything. We should just print a message to the user. All right. So after this, all our buttons, the 4 buttons should work fine. All right. So my computer today, in fact, this is not just today, it's perpetually becoming very slow. Okay, so we are here now. Let's share the image. So this is what we have. When we come to this here, now we see what we can do here. So we can go to next, 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 next. Now we could go to previous. So we move back to the first image, and then it tells us we are on the first image. Once we come here, we are on the first image. Or we go to the next. So as we keep going, keep flipping through the images till we get to the last one. So once we are on the last one, we could come to the first one also. We are back to the first one. We could go to the last one again, back to the first one, back to the last one. So we could keep doing all that. So we go to the next item, previous item, next item, first item, last item, and so on, right? So we could program this to close this window also. So we could go ahead and just program that. So the label click, so we just have me, the close. Okay, so that is fine. So the next thing we'll do now is to go ahead and program the slideshow. So go ahead and program this slideshow. So once we program the slideshow, we could easily take care of the rest of the things that we intend to do. So how do we program the slideshow? So first of all, basically what we do is we start from the index 0, then we retrieve the item in the item with the index 0, then we display it here, and then we stop the thread, or we put the thread to sleep for 5 seconds, then we wake it up and then increase the index by 1, then pass that index to the image list again, and then load the image, put it to sleep for 5 seconds, right? So we keep doing that till we get to the end of the images. So let's quickly go ahead and see how we can code that. So we are coding the start slideshow button, right? So the usual thing that we have been repeating all throughout, that is the number of images. So the next one, I think I will go up there and let's create it, maybe something like this. So we create it as a separate variable here. Let me just, now I've already repeated it throughout, so I'll just tell you that once you come here, you create this variable here and assign this value to it, and just forget about it and move on, because this here is wasting our time. Number of images is equal to image list 1 dot images dot count, right? Then we will use a for loop to loop through these images. So we say for index equals 0 to number of images minus 1, right? Then step 1, right? So we start with this, and then we get to the total number of images minus 1, which will give us the index of the last element. So we would then go through and then pass that index to every one of the images. So we have images, so picture box 1 dot images, or image is equal to image list 1 dot images dot item into bracket index. All right, so once we pass that, then we can go ahead and then we refresh the form. So me dot refresh. All right, then we would now put the let's say the window to sleep for a few seconds, right, to show the image for a few seconds. So we have system dot thread, so threading dot thread dot sleep brackets. So you can say 5 milliseconds. Okay. So once we create that, what it means is that it should put whatever thread or whatever part of the processor that this code is running, it should put it to sleep for 5 seconds. Now, anytime we run an application, a software thread is created for that application, and that software thread runs on a hardware thread, right? So we can actually write a code to put that software thread and the hardware thread to sleep for a moment, right? Whilst we just view the image. And then after that, it will wake up again and then do it again and put it to sleep for that long. So that is where the image will come and stay for us to look at it for that period of time, after which they need to show a different image. All right. So we would run our code to see how it will come out. So this is what we have. So if we come here and then we go there, so we go to next, previous, and then we start our slideshow. All right. So once we start the slideshow, we'll see that our user interface would be frozen while the pictures are showing. Right? We just freeze while the pictures are showing. Now this is not very desirable, right? We can't do anything with our window. We can't, it is frozen. You can't move it. You can't basically do anything, which is not the best. All right. Yes, you can see the application is working. It is looping through your images without you clicking on any button. It is doing what it's supposed to do, but it is not working as intended in terms of user experience. Because when I'm watching or when I'm looping through my images, I wouldn't want my system to just freeze and then I can't do anything about it. I can't look at it. I mean, I can only look at it. I can't interact with this software while it is running. Now that is very poor human-computer interaction principles that are being applied here. So we need to create this software in such a way that even as the loop is running, the system will still remain responsive, right? So that we could do other things on this software. So even if I want to cancel it, right, I can't cancel it because the whole form is frozen, right? That is bad. So we need to introduce some other concepts that will help us to get this thing running. All right. So let me try and see if I can basically exit it from here. So that's the only way I can exit it. Other than that, I'll have to wait till the slideshow ends. Then the user can now interact with the app. Now that is not a very good user experience. All right. So how do we make sure that we are able to do this? Now, in order to be able to do this, we would have to introduce the concept of threads or threading. And as I said, anytime we run an application, a software thread is created for that application. Now that software thread is actually assigned to a particular hardware thread or a particular core of a processor, and then the execution happens. So once we are running that software thread, our code is running on a particular hardware. So we can actually stop the thread, we can start the thread, we can basically pause the thread, we can do so many things with the thread to get our application to behave the way we want. So usually one of the easiest bugs in the code is to try and execute a huge time-consuming operation on the same thread as the user interface. Now, when that happens, the user interface freezes, causing a whole lot of performance issues for the software. So usually when we have a huge loop or a huge data processing task, we kind of try to separate that task from the thread that runs the user interface. So we can create a separate thread for our action, right? So we usually do that using, of course, parallel programming. That is, we use what we call the parallel task library, which is not within the scope of the course that we are doing now. But those of us who are interested, we can go and look at the parallel task library in Visual Studio, or in most of Microsoft products, we have C#, Visual Studio, and so on, they all have libraries that will help us to develop applications for multi-core processors. But of course, one of the easiest ways we can do that now, or the simplest way for now, if we don't really need all the functionalities that come with the task parallel library, we could use just some few things to try to at least improve the performance of our application. So in this case, we would add what we call the background worker. That is what we were talking about earlier on. So we create a background worker and use that to create a separate thread for our application. All right. So when we add the background worker, we would basically begin to increase or reorganize our code to see how best we can handle it. So background. So a background worker control, that is what is here. So we can just drop that on the form, and as usual, it will also come underneath. So you will not have it on the form, you have it underneath the form. All right. So once we place it on the form, then we can begin to program it to do whatever we want it to do. So we would just double click on it, right? So you would have the work, that is the do work event. So whatever we need to execute, so this here will create an entire new thread that will not run on the thread that is running the user interface. So whatever huge processing we need to do, we can bring the processing down here to free the user interface. So in this case, when that code is running, it is running on a separate thread than the user interface. So it won't freeze the user interface. All right. So we will just copy this guy here, or we cut it, and then we bring it. Now we cut and left some. We will just cut the first code that we wrote for the start button. We bring it here. So what it means is that we are running it on a totally different thread that will not have any serious consequences on the user interface thread. So when we do that, then we can just come and write here in the start button. We just write to initiate the thread, or we would begin to run the thread from here. So we write background worker 1 dot run worker sync, right? So when we run worker sync, now this here is basically the line of code we use to run here. But when we run it from the main thread, so this will run on the main thread, but then it will call another task here that is running on a separate thread. So when this is running, the user interface thread will be relaxed and free so while this is running, the user interface will still remain responsive. All right. So let's test that and see what we'll get. This time when we run our application, it won't freeze. It will just continue to work without any issues. Okay, so we'll add another guy here. So we would have this, open that. So once we run it, we can go next, last item, first item, this, right, next, previous. So we can see all is working. So if we press on start, now something went wrong. Now they're telling me the thread that I'm trying to access is not within the thread that is trying to access it. Yes, I know that. That is why I wrote this code. Now, the application is complaining, or the compiler is complaining, because we did not, we are trying to access different threads from another thread. Now, by default, the compiler will want to keep track of which application is running on which threads, or which code is running on which threads, to try to keep some consistency, to make sure that no cross-thread referencing happens in an illegal way, right? So you cannot try to access a variable that is on a different thread without first of all going through the thread management system. So here we usually want to disable all the issues that has to do with that. So usually in our load event, we can go and input something like that. So we control dot check for illegal cross-thread calls, right? We want to disable that, right? So that is what is causing our error right now. So we make it false so that it doesn't check for illegal cross. So because what we want to do is a bit unacceptable technically, right? But then we need to do it in order to execute our task. So sometimes we disable some of the functionalities to help us to do what we want to do. So once we have disabled this, this code here should now run without any issues. Okay. So let's go to this. All right, let's share our screen first of all. So once we share our screen, we go back here and then we get this form. And once we click on this, it should be rotating to show our image. But then also, once it is going on, we can still click on buttons. You can see that the form is still responsive, even though it is going through the slideshow. So which is what we wanted to achieve. We want to make sure that whilst the application is running, we would make sure all the buttons are running, right? So we could exit in the middle of it, right? We could just close it without any issue, right? That is where we have gotten to. But then the next thing we need to do is also to put in a progress bar, which is a bar that we want to use to monitor the progress of our application. So when the slideshow is going on, we would be monitoring what is going on. So we could expand our form just a little bit to get us a little bit more space to put in this progress bar. So we would just move some of these things downwards a little bit so that we can get a place to put in a progress bar. So let's look for progress bar. So that is what we have here. We would push it down here and then we expand it all the way down here. All right, so we can make it smaller, we can make it bigger, it doesn't really matter. So you put it in a way that you like. So we would have progress bar. So we can go ahead and then write a little code in the slideshow to basically keep track of this progress bar. So let's look at how to incorporate that in here. So we will come to this side and then put that in. So with the progress bar, we would want to do that before the refreshing. So we say progress bar 1. So we'll use that for the value. So progress bar 1 dot value is equal to, so what will be the value of each image in the progress bar? So we will consider the entire progress bar as 100%, right? So each image would be the index over the total number of images times 100. to give you its portion of progress. So once we complete one image, it will be 1 over the total number of images times 100. Once we do that, then we continue to move ahead. So we'll say the index plus 1, right? So since we are starting from 0, so it is not advisable. So sometimes I sometimes just use the index alone, because I want it to work in such a way that the first image until it is done and the second image starts, then we won't record the entire first image into the list box, right? That's one way of doing it. But of course, we could just go this way. So index over the number of, that's the number of images. Okay, that's what is here. All right, times 100. All right, so once we get that, then our progress bar is ready to go. So let's quickly check it out. So we would have so when we run this, go in here and do this. So once we are here, we could run that. So you can see as soon as we start, then the progress bar is going to start. So once we get here, progress bar starts and just keeps going, all right, till we get to 100 or till we get to the end. So you can see the progress bar continues to move as the images continue to come and go. So at any point in time, even though you don't know the total number of images that are there, you can see what percentage of images have come and what percentage of images are left to come. All right. So once we, of course, we didn't indicate that we want to somewhere interrupt with the slideshow. So that's sometimes when you stop it in the middle, your compiler will complain, but we are going to resolve all those things before we leave here today. All right, so as we can see, the progress bar is progressing steadily. So that is one of the reasons why this here is complaining. So once we are done with that, so we will now configure our thread in such a way that we would be able to interrupt the slideshow. That is, we can stop it in the middle without the compiler complaining about it. Or when we stop it in the middle, we want to reset the progress bar back to 0 and so on. So we need to do certain things before we will be able to do that. So in order to do that, we have to indicate that the background worker should be able to cancel, right? So we can cancel it by saying that the background worker should support cancellation. And then we also say that if a cancellation is pending, what should happen? It should stop the execution of the thread. That is e.cancel, the same way we did the e.cancel for the close in one of our, the me.close in one of our exercises. And then we set the progress bar to 0, and then we exit the for loop. So we would have something like this. Background worker dot, right, worker supports cancellation is equal to what? True, right? So we want to be able to cancel the thread while it is still executing, so that there won't be any complaint from the compiler. So once we decide to cancel, what should happen, right? So that's what we need to talk about. So if background worker one dot cancellation pending, all right? So if we are trying to cancel, what should happen, right? It means you should cancel the sub procedure, right? Not true. And then also you should set the progress bar value, progress bar dot value to 0, right? And then you should exit this for loop, right? So once that is done, then we can easily cancel this thing without any issue. So we can write the code to basically stop the slideshow, right? So here, if we click on this, we need to check whether even the thread is running, right? If the thread is not running and you press on cancel, it shouldn't do anything, right? But if the thread is running and you click on cancel, then it will take steps to cancel it. So we first of all have to check if the thread is running, right? So we write background. So if background worker background worker one dot is busy, right? Then what should happen, right? So it should check if it supports cancellation. So if background one, so remember we already said that it should support cancellation dot support cancellation. Right, then what should happen? So background worker dot cancel sync. Okay, that's what we want to do. So we want to cancel the thread that is executing the slideshow. But of course, we first of all want to check whether the thread is even running, so that when we are not doing any slideshow and we click on the button, nothing should happen. But then once it is running, then we want to check whether it actually supports cancellation, which is why we put this here. So once it supports cancellation, then we'll go ahead and cancel it. All right. So that is basically what we are trying to do. So let's run it and let's see how it goes. So we share the screen first. So once we share the screen, we can go straight away to our items. So we move next, we move previous, we move last first. So everything works fine. We move slideshow, and then as the progress bar goes on, the slideshow keeps going. Of course, we can reduce the time for the images by changing from 5 seconds to maybe 2 seconds, right? So it will move faster. So you can decide or whether you want it to go in milliseconds. So you can put in maybe 1,000 milliseconds, right? Then you can, or is it 1,000 microseconds? Then you can begin to watch the slideshow move faster. All right, so once it is going, we could just stop it, right? So once we stop it, you can see the slideshow has stopped. It just stopped on whichever image it is, then it becomes 0, right? So we can start it over, then it can start over by itself. Okay. So at any point in time, we could stop it. Okay, so this is what we have set out to achieve, and let's look at our slideshow. All right, so at the end, this is what we have gotten. So we can go next, 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 next to the end, and go to the last image, and go to the first image, last image, and come to previous, previous, right? However way you want it. All right, the same way we could start a slideshow and go through to the end, and then we could cancel the slideshow without any consequences. So these are basically the things that we set out to achieve, and then we have achieved them all. So please play around with it, change the code, change the user interface, and then you see how best you can get it. So along the week, you would receive an assignment on the course page based on what we just did. So I expect everybody to complete both tutorials, and then we meet again next week with more tutorials to come. So thank you for taking part, and then have a nice day.